Eritrea is independent. The U.S. opposes that. That's why it's so demonized, as you explained. But I think its independence is also dangerous in some ways for U.S. interests because it hasn't been subjected to a lot of the kinds of schemes, the sort of capitalist neoliberal schemes that the U.S. has imposed, or imperialist schemes that the U.S. has imposed on a lot of the rest of Africa. It actually has some better social indicators compared to its peers. So I wanted to give you a chance to maybe talk a little bit about that, because people don't get to hear about Eritrea from this context. It's only ever bad Eritrea. Soldiers are everywhere just committing genocide. That's all we hear, literally.
That is all you hear. The other thing you hear is that it's the North Korea of the African continent, which is, it's meant as a slander, but it's also such a backhanded slander to North Korea. The reality is, compared to, say, Chad, the average person living in Chad, living in, Pyongyang would be like living in a paradise. So, I actually think I just wanted to note that at the outset that, you can see Eritrea is more broadly linked to this attempt by Western political forces to demonize nations that are viewed to be aberrant and deviant from the so-called rules-based international order in any significant way. Cuba is the world's worst dictatorship. North Korea is the world's worst dictatorship. Eritrea is the world's worst dictatorship. Venezuela is the world's. Yeah, everyone is the world's worst dictatorship. Only if you hate the United States. But right across the ocean there, from the sea, from Eritrea, is the Gulf, where the entire place is based on forced slave-like labor and massive income inequality and cutting people's heads off and hands off for the most basic of crimes. But that doesn't make you some sort of evil pariah.
Eugene, they're reforming.
Right.
They're reforming.
Yeah, exactly. And there you have it. But anyway, I say all that to say that I think it's important to recognize, and there are a number of things you could say, but I think one thing that I think is worth noting in terms of, the role Eritrea plays and certainly the attitude that imperialism has taken towards it, certainly in the context of this conflict, is exactly what was said, I think it was just about a month ago, by the Eritrean representative in the conference of the LDCs, the least developed countries. And they made a really important point in the Eritrean contribution that I think speaks very much to this. They said in the entire time, I believe it's 50 years, that the LDC group has existed. And it exists in the context of a range of international frameworks. And the entire time the LDC group has existed, only 2 countries have graduated from the least developed countries. And the Eritrean representative says, why is that? And they go on to say many other things. And I think it's worth reading. It's a very short thing, their presentation there. But I think that in and of itself is key. And you could also see this in the contribution they made to the United Nations General Assembly this year, where they are very clearly stating that the reason some countries are developed and some countries are not is not random. It's not by accident. Is in fact by the deliberate policy of the powerful nations, and that they manipulate their power and their control over so many critical levers of the global economy and the broader international community in order to keep this enforced poverty, this enforced underdevelopment as the state of affairs for the whole world. And so obviously, for the point of view of the United States, they hate all countries who point this out. And Eritrea, even though it's never talked about, is one of these countries that points this out. And I think that's one of the main reasons that they have been demonized, isolated, and why, of course, there is a deep fear by the United States and others about what it would mean for Eritrea to play a bigger role, not just in the Horn of Africa, but if they're playing a bigger role in the Horn of Africa and in the state of Africa, and as we can see now as part of the Friends of the UN Charter group started by Venezuela and China, it also starts to break their isolation and allow them to receive more assistance from countries that don't want to tell them exactly what to do. Because one of the main principles in Eritrea is that they don't take aid that doesn't conform to their own development approach, which is to produce, to focus really mainly on the fundamentals and the foundation of the base and build up from there. So to, put sustainability on the table, to put food sovereignty on the table as a major issue, the development of basic education, the development of technical and higher education, the development of healthcare systems. And they've done quite a bit in 30 years of independence. And I want to speak to this in terms of the indicators, but I think it's also important to note the critique that they themselves have raised up about this issue, which is important, not just to Eritrea, but to Venezuela, to Cuba, to other countries that are, developing countries facing big economic challenges, is that it's not just the issue of being underdeveloped. It's that anyone who chooses a development path that, again, doesn't speak to that ascribed role of friend, where you may be seeking you're not seeking enemies in the United States, but you're seeking to improve the living standards and the livelihood of your country and your region in a way that will move you out of the ascribed underdeveloped role that they've set for you, that is, even if you haven't even accomplished it yet, that is a huge challenge because it's an ideological challenge to the idea that neo-colonialism is the only way that developing nations can approach the way that they engage with the world and the way that they engage with the world economy. Now, I hope you don't mind I look at my notes here for a second because I want to get this right, because I do think that this is an important issue in terms of how you look at country, because if you're going to say someone is the worst of the worst, and that's why I raised up that issue of North Korea, some would say DPRK, compared it to Cuba, compared it to Venezuela, because there's a similar issue here where the countries are listed as the worst of the worst and all these different things. And then when you actually start to look at the numbers, they in fact are not the worst of the worst. So just throw a few things out here for you that I think people would be relevant. And again, sorry for looking at my notes, but again, I want to get it right about Eritrea here. Eritrea has a higher literacy rate than Pakistan, Nigeria, Egypt, Mali, Niger, and Sudan. They have a higher life expectancy than Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique. Now, I want to just reiterate some of what I just said. In the first two, that they have a higher literacy rate than Nigeria, that they have a higher life expectancy than Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the richest nations on the planet Earth. There's no reason why people are living in abject poverty all across that country. And that right there should tell you something, because Nigeria is one of America's best friends on the African continent and has been for some time. And their social indicators are shameful. Their use of resources, the income inequality, the looting, the kleptocracy, shameful conditions for people of Nigeria. Lower life expectancy than Eritrea, lower literacy rate, and you never hear anything that's said about Eritrea said about Nigeria. And that's not a huge knock on other African countries, but I think it's important. Also, Pakistan, Pakistan obviously has many development issues, but lower literacy rate than Eritrea, lower life expectancy than Eritrea. When you look at access to improved drinking water, this is a big issue in Eritrea. It's one of the main things that they're working on is access to water, access to more sanitation facilities. I think it's something like 54% of villages now or communities are open defecation free, which is a big thing that was celebrated this year by some of the UN agencies that Eritrea had accomplished. And that's a big thing. So improved drinking water, that's a huge issue. That's something that they're focusing on. So more people in Eritrea have access to improved drinking water. Safely managed water. This is a different one. Similar sort of stat, but more people in Eritrea have access to safely managed water, so clean water, than Nigeria, Pakistan, Congo, Brazzaville, and Peru. So again, there you go. Yet again, you look at the issue of infant mortality. There's a lower infant mortality in Eritrea than in Nigeria, India, Pakistan, Mali, Zambia, Benin, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Uganda, and Chad. And there is a higher employment to population ratio, which is basically the number of people who are of working age that are actually working rather than just sitting around idle and unemployed, than Nigeria, South Africa, Pakistan, El Salvador, and Colombia. So
when you mention a lot of the countries that you're mentioning are very strong U.S. allies. Again, yeah. I just think that's a really important thing to note. Yes. But continue.
There are also more primary age school children in school in Eritrea than in Pakistan or Nigeria. But I say all that to say, not that everything's perfect. I would not say that. The government would not say that. And in fact, I mean, if you don't believe me, you can just go look at the government-produced documents from Eritrea, where they actually talk quite a bit, not just about their successes, but about their challenges, about the attempts to address climate change, have sustainability, and have food sovereignty in a country that, in fact, because of the nature of the geography, only has limited access to water. They built something like 700 dams, by the way, since 1991 to help manage water and manage agriculture. About the need, you read an article that say, well, we've done a great job bringing in more doctors, but we still haven't done enough. So no one is claiming that that it's not a developing nation. It's obviously in the LDC group. It's growing from a very low base. It's only 30 years old as a country. It's emerging from almost 30 more years of essentially guerrilla-based conflict, and it's in an area that already was economically depressed due to the nature of the structure of the global economy, and that in and of itself faces its own relative challenges to that sort of geographical reality. So no one is trying to make any wild claims here. But when you look at what they have done in that 30 years, obviously around some of the key human social indicators that we look to all around the world to determine how people are doing, they're doing significantly better than countries that are best friends with the United States and receive huge sums of money and all sorts of trade preferences from them that Eritrea is totally excluded from. And what is the difference? The difference to me seems very clear. that Eritrea is pursuing a development path that is based on more equitable development, based on a more social justice type approach to not having huge income inequality and huge differences between the rural areas and the urban areas, that's seeking to build a strong foundation to grow a strong economy up from. And we've seen, if you look at a country like, say, China, I mean, that's a big sense of why China is successful now, is they spent the first 40 or so years of the country building up a very strong foundation, a very strong base. And, ultimately, these types of politics and politics that they're willing to call this out on the international stage in terms of what is really going on in the broader situation, I think is something the U.S. hates. But I think it deserves much more credit. It deserves much more focus. There is much more that I think people should see and know about what's going on there. And there's a lot to be said for other African nations that are at a similar level of development, other nations around the world, but especially in Africa, which is a continent that has been forced into brutal, humiliating neocolonialism, about how to really build up an equitable economic, social substructure as we go into the 21st century. I think many of the questions there, you look at the other small country that's considered, relatively successful economically is Rwanda. Rwanda is the opposite, right? It's sort of the U.S. imperialist satrapy approach to what 21st century African development should be. I think Eritrea is offering some different answers to some similar questions that I think deserves a closer look. And I think, again, as you can see from those social indicators, already with almost none of the similar resources compared to a country like Nigeria that's ultra rich, none of the serious similar resources as many of these other countries that are getting unlimited aid from the United States and still delivering terrible social indicators, that they've been able to transcend that and get over some of these in important areas. And I think that deserves to be said and it deserves to be recognized.